Tonight, we walk straight into the ruthless, the addictive, and the unfiltered truth of a powder that sold dreams and destroyed them. Forget the movie lights and the stories that fade to black before it gets real. Living it wasn't wild, it was war. So before you settle in, take a breath. Set the volume just above a whisper. Let's leave the modern world behind. Up here, in the razor-thin air of the high Andes, every breath feels like a battle. The sun isn't gentle here, it burns, and nestled into this sharp, cloud-brushed terrain, a simple green leaf held something more powerful than food or fire. For thousands of years it was holy, long before gold filled the vaults of empires, before Spanish ships crossed oceans with cannons and crosses. There was coca, the divine leaf. Its story begins not with a written record, but with traces in the soil and whispers from the dead. Archaeologists have found the leaf's alkaloid signature in the hair of ancient Peruvian mummies, their bodies wrapped in cloth finer than royalty and buried with a small pouch. Inside, a bundle of carefully chosen dried green leaves. This wasn't for habit, it was for communion, a ritual bond between people and a world that took more than it gave. The plant itself is easy to miss. A modest shrub with bright green leaves, white blossoms, and small red berries, it clings to the steep, humid slopes of the Yungas, those mist-wrapped eastern Andes foothills. Here, ancient civilizations carved staircases into the mountain, walls of stone reaching skyward to make vertical farm terraces where the sacred plant could grow. To the Inca, the final and greatest empire of the Andes, this wasn't just a plant. They called her Mama Coca, the Mother Coca, a goddess, a gift from the sun god Inti, sent to calm the suffering of his children. But divine gifts weren't free, and they weren't for everyone. The Inca ran an empire of stone, logic, and command. Roads laced the mountains. Taxes were paid in labor, not coins. And coca, it was state property. You couldn't just chew it. You had to earn it. It was a privilege rationed for nobles, priests, and the elite. When high priests needed divine counsel, they'd press the leaves into their cheek, letting the bitter chemicals numb their tongue and slow their breath. The patterns left behind when scattered on sacred cloth were read like prophecy, signs of war, harvest, or life itself. When officials journeyed across the empire, they traveled with measured coca. When commoners were drafted for mita, the brutal state labor that raised the walls of Machu Picchu, they were given a daily handful. Not for pleasure, for fuel. Coca dulled hunger. It fought the cold. It let the body forget how high the mountains truly were. The Inca's lifeline was its network of roads, and no one knew them better than the imperial runners, trained from childhood to sprint between outposts. These men were the ancient internet, message relays who could deliver word from Quito to Cusco in less than a week. They didn't carry weapons, they carried coca, and with it they ran through cloud and storms, delivering orders that could change the fate of a kingdom. Then, in 1532, the world tilted. The Spanish arrived. Metal armor, horses, guns, and a different god. They saw coca, and like so many things in the New World, they misunderstood it. The Catholic missionaries labeled the leaf demonic, an idol, a curse. Early orders from Lima tried to erase it, banning cultivation, forbidding its use. But the priests' sermons couldn't compete with silver. Because nestled high above sea level, in a place where men gasped for air, the Spanish found a mountain made of wealth, Potosi, a tower of ore that gleamed with imperial promise. But they needed hands, thousands of them. And when native workers began to collapse in the tunnels, coughing blood, poisoned by mercury, crushed under rock, the colonizers made a quiet calculation. Coca kept people standing, keep them digging, feed them less, paid them less, got more silver. Economics silenced morality, and soon the very church that had cursed the leaf was planting coca fields of its own. What was once a divine right of kings became a daily ration for slaves. The leaf now powered an empire of extraction, a grim machine that pulled blood and treasure from the Andes and shipped it across oceans to fund Spanish wars and palaces. For 3 centuries it stayed like this, a local sacrament, a local sorrow. Its true power, chemical, global, is still locked inside. That would change, not in a temple, but in a lab. In 19th century Europe, science was ablaze. Chemists were hunting the secrets of nature, naming compounds like trophies. They'd already tamed morphine, quinine, caffeine, and the green leaf from the Andes, newly arrived, sun-dried and compressed in cargo, drew their curiosity. In 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Gaedge isolated a crude yellow compound from coca. He called it erythroxyline, but the process was flawed. The result was unstable. Then, in 1860, in a quiet university town, a young student named Albert Niemann refined the method. He boiled and washed and filtered the raw leaves until he extracted something pure crystal white, bitter, numbing. He named it with scientific precision from the plant itself, and the suffix reserved for its kind, cocaine. At first, nobody noticed. The world wasn't ready. It was just another entry in a chemical journal, a compound with no market. That changed with wine. The transformation began in Paris, not in a university, but behind the counter of a wine shop. Angelo Mariani, a Corsican with the instincts of a showman, saw a moment. Europe was tired, nervous, worn thin by city life, factory whistles and long winters. Mariani knew how to sell dreams, and he saw one steeped in red Bordeaux and soaked in crushed coca leaves. In 1863, he launched a creation, Vin Mariani, a medicinal wine, yes, but also a luxurious tonic. The alcohol pulled the cocaine from the leaf. The result was smooth, sweet, and euphoric, a wine with a kick like no other. And it took off like wildfire. Mariani wasn't just a chemist. He was a marketing pioneer. He collected endorsements like trophies, popes, queens, inventors, writers. Pope Leo XIII gave him a medal. Queen Victoria sipped it. Thomas Edison claimed it kept his ideas flowing deep into the night. Ulysses S. Grant drank it as he wrote his memoirs while battling cancer. Writers from Jules Verne to Émile Zola sang its praises. It wasn't just a tonic, it was culture, it was cure, it was comfort. And across the Atlantic, in a wounded country still healing from civil war, a man named John Pemberton took notice. Pemberton had been a Confederate soldier, he'd been injured, and like many of his fellow veterans, he'd been prescribed morphine. The cure became a chain. He was addicted. Searching for freedom, he looked to the leaf. Inspired by Mariani's success, he brewed his own version, Pemberton's French wine coca, a rich syrup infused with coca leaf and spiked with caffeine from the African cola nut. It worked. People loved it. But in 1886, Prohibition came to his county in Georgia. No more alcohol. Pemberton pivoted. He removed the wine, kept the coca, sweetened the base, and added fizz. He called it Coca-Cola. And in that moment, the world's most famous soft drink was born not in a boardroom, but in the swirling mixture of addiction, commerce, and the coca leaf. Each glass sold at the soda fountain came with a promise: energy, relief, clarity. But what it also came with, though no one whispered it then, was a small but potent dose of cocaine. Coca-Cola wasn't alone. A wave of tonics followed, bottles labeled with bold claims and mysterious ingredients. People didn't ask, they just sipped. And as soda fountains fizzed and sales soared, medicine began to pay closer attention. One man in particular, young, ambitious, and searching for greatness, took notice. His name was Sigmund Freud. In 1884, Freud wasn't yet the father of psychoanalysis. He was a researcher in Vienna, broke, eager and desperate to make a name. When he read early studies of cocaine, his curiosity turned inward. He dosed himself, and he liked what he found. In his paper, Über Coca, he described the effects in glowing terms. A miracle, he called it. A substance that lifted depression, sharpened the mind, and gave the body a glow of invincibility. He believed passionately that it could cure morphine addiction. He prescribed it widely, to colleagues, to patients, even to his fiancée, Martha, for strength, for color in the cheeks, for joy. Freud's endorsement gave cocaine a powerful new image, not just a party tonic, but a serious medical agent. Scientists took note. So did doctors. And in an operating theater, another transformation took place. Carl Koller, an ophthalmologist and one of Freud's peers, tested what Freud had mentioned in passing, that cocaine numbed the tongue. He wondered, would it numb the eye? He tried it. A few drops of solution, then surgery on a conscious patient with no pain, no flinch, no scream. It was a revelation. Before this, surgeons had only two options: speed or sedation. Either you worked fast and brutal, or you knocked the patient out cold and hoped they woke up. Now they could be awake and still. Cocaine became the world's first local anesthetic. In eye surgery, dentistry, delicate operations once deemed impossible, this was a miracle drug. And in the final 2 decades of the 1800s, it was everywhere. Parke-Davis, a rising American pharmaceutical company, sold it in powders, vials, syringes. There were cocaine cigarettes, cocaine-infused lozenges for sore throats, even toothache drops for infants. There were tonics for ladies' nerves, chewing gums for fatigue, elixirs for the overworked clerk and the exhausted housewife. It was elegant. It was scientific. It was modern. The coca leaf, once sacred, then exploited, had been transformed again. Its essence, stripped and isolated, had become a fashionable answer to the modern world's every question. But something else had been stripped too. Its soul. The ascent was dazzling. Cocaine had gone from sacred to scientific, from mountain leaf to miracle cure. And for a moment, it seemed like the world had found a secret it would never let go of. But secrets, when shared too widely, start to crack. The first warnings came in whispers, isolated cases, a doctor here, a patient there, a strange complaint, restlessness, sleeplessness, then something stranger, a crawling sensation under the skin, like invisible insects, scratching, biting, burrowing. They called them cocaine bugs. Then came paranoia, hallucinations, euphoria that turned into compulsion, performance that blurred into obsession. The miracle began to tarnish, and nowhere was the fall more personal than in Freud's own life. He had introduced cocaine to his close friend, Ernst von Fleischl, a brilliant scientist struggling with morphine addiction. Freud hoped to save him. Instead, he doomed him. Fleischl-Marxow traded one dependency for another, but this one burned faster, deeper. Within months, he was seeing snakes white, hissing, crawling over his arms. His mind unraveled. He died not long after, broken and tormented. Freud stopped speaking publicly about cocaine. Quietly, he distanced himself. But the damage was done. The cure he had championed was beginning to show its cost. The newspapers picked up the scent, and like any good scandal, they chased it. Once celebrated tonics became cautionary tales. The same magazines that had run glowing ads now printed panic headlines, stories of collapsed performers, disgraced doctors, ruined lives. In America, the story took a darker turn. The drug, once seen as an upper-class indulgence, began to be weaponized in the public imagination, not for what it did, but for who was using it. In the South, a new racial mythology took shape. Whispers became warnings, warnings became headlines. Cocaine, they claimed, gave black men superhuman strength, made them aggressive, made them bulletproof. Newspapers, even the New York Times, printed wild, racist claims that cocaine made black laborers violent, uncontrollable, criminal. In 1914, a doctor named Edward H. Williams claimed publicly that police needed bigger guns. Regular pistols, he insisted, couldn't stop a cocaine-crazed Negro. The narrative was clear. This wasn't about addiction. It was about control and fear. This propaganda served a purpose. It justified action. The drug, once sold over the counter, now became a social threat, and threats, in America, are legislated. That same year, the U.S. passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. On the surface, it was simple. Importers and sellers had to register and pay taxes. It didn't ban cocaine outright, but in practice, it squeezed the supply and criminalized the addict. Doctors were no longer allowed to prescribe cocaine to known addicts. If they did, they risked arrest. Some were jailed, others quit medicine altogether. Pharmacies stopped selling it. Coca-Cola, seeing the shift, quietly removed the active alkaloid around 1903, even before the law passed. The leaf was being pushed out of the light. What had been a medicine, a curiosity, a symbol of modern chemistry, now slipped underground. And in the shadows, something else took root. Not addiction, not science, but exclusivity. When a substance becomes forbidden, it becomes valuable. When a ritual becomes criminal, it becomes elite. And so cocaine, no longer sold at soda fountains, found a new home in the hushed corners of the roaring 1920s. The 1920s weren't quiet. They howled. America, freshly out of war and flush with jazz, electricity, and bootleg gin, didn't stop to look back. It danced forward, wild and defiant. And in the flickering candlelight of smoky clubs and secret lounges, the little white powder returned. Cocaine had lost its medical mask, but it found a new costume: luxury, danger, exclusivity. In speakeasies tucked behind bookstore doors, in velvet-curtained rooms of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, the elite gathered flappers with bobbed hair, tycoons with slicked hair, artists with tired eyes. The jazz played hot and fast. The lights were low, and cocaine flowed in whispers. It wasn't sold openly. It didn't have to be. A small vial in a pocket, a bump behind a mirror. It was subtle, private, sacred even. For dancers, it kept the party going past midnight. For brokers, it added speed to already speeding minds. For writers, it felt like clarity in powder form. You weren't just using, you were included, inside the circle, one of them. On the other coast, in a place where dreams were being manufactured at 24 frames per second, the white powder found another willing host: Hollywood. Silent films were loud behind the scenes. The stars, plucked from obscurity and thrust into instant fame, were expected to shine, always. Days on set were long, nights were longer. The studios didn't care how you stayed alert, only that you did. They called it girl or nose candy, nicknames to soften the truth. Wallace Reed, a beloved leading man, suffered an injury on set. He was prescribed morphine. When that failed, cocaine entered. It didn't save him. It silenced him. His death in 1923 exposed the cracks in the Hollywood glamour machine. The industry panicked not from grief, but from bad press. The Hays Code, a moral rule book for movie stars, was born, but it couldn't cleanse the powder from the parties. It just drove it deeper. Even outside the spotlight, cocaine found patrons in Parisian cafes and Greenwich Village basements. To the bohemians and thinkers, it wasn't a drug. It was a muse, a shortcut to insight, a tool for writing, for painting, for pushing past the barrier of doubt and sleep. For the surrealist painter, it brought jagged visions. For the struggling novelist, it kept the typewriter keys clacking into the blue hours of dawn. But the clarity it promised was often a mirage. Ideas spun in circles, paintings turned frantic, books lost coherence, and still the myth endured. Cocaine was genius, bottled and bagged. But dreams cost money, and someone had to supply them. Enter the underworld. Organized crime, already flourishing from bootlegging, saw an opportunity. Cocaine was easier than liquor, smaller, cleaner, and far more profitable. Smugglers who once ran whiskey barrels now trafficked tiny glass vials. Arnold Rothstein, the man whispered to have fixed the 1919 World Series, understood this perfectly. Cocaine was high value, low risk, and traveled well. No trucks, no warehouses, just the right couriers and the right bribes. Distribution lines were forming, quiet, effective, global. In Europe, shipments moved from South America to Spain, then into France, Italy, Germany. In the U.S., it slipped in through ports, hidden in perfume, fabric, even religious relics. The market didn't explode. It simmered discreet but steady. This was cocaine's liminal age. No longer legal, not yet warred against, a chemical in exile. A secret handshake passed in mirrored restrooms and smoky rooms, from heiresses to jazz drummers to underground poets. A powder not for the poor, not yet. That chapter would come, and it would be louder. Far to the south, under the thin, burning sun of the Andes, the leaf never left. While poets and partygoers in the north whispered over lines in Peru and Bolivia, the coca leaf remained what it had always been: survival. In small villages clinging to the mountains, farmers still chewed coca for strength. Mixed with ash or lime, the leaves released just enough alkaloid to dull fatigue, to ease hunger, to keep lungs working in the cruel altitude. No glamour, no luxury, just work. Just breath. Coca was sacred, woven into rituals, shared at funerals, offered to the earth itself. But the world had changed. The powder form, isolated, refined, weaponized, had found new value, and someone was always willing to chase that value, even if it meant corrupting what was once divine. The shift came not with a bang, but with chemistry. In the mid-20th century, entrepreneurs, not yet kingpins, not yet legends, began to map a new path for cocaine. They weren't the flashy warlords of later headlines. They were patient, business-minded, invisible. Their vision was simple: take the leaf and industrialize it. Chile became the early hub. In Santiago and Valparaiso, quiet networks formed. Smugglers who had dabbled in other contraband jewels, arms, people now turned to the leaf. They learned to control not just transport, but transformation. One of the earliest pioneers was a woman known only as La Madrina, the godmother. She ran a restaurant by day. By night, she built one of the first real trafficking chains. Her operation was crude by today's standards, but it worked. The model she developed became the blueprint for every cartel that followed. Here's how it worked. Coca leaves were harvested deep in the jungles of Bolivia and Peru. Poor farmers picked them by hand, packed them into burlap sacks, and carried them to hidden pits in the forest. There, the first transformation happened. Gasoline, kerosene, lime. The leaves were soaked, stomped, mashed. A thick slurry formed. It smelled like chemicals and death. This goo was then mixed with acid, filtered, dried. What came out was not cocaine, not yet. It was pasta base cocaine paste, a rough, yellowish chunk with high potency and low purity, easier to smuggle than leaves, stronger by weight, ready for the next step. The paste was flown out of the jungle on tiny planes, rusting single-prop aircraft with cracked windows and no flight plans. They soared across the Andes and landed in the deserts of northern Chile. There, in basements and barns, the chemists got to work. Using ether, acetone, ammonia, and hours of careful hands, they transformed the paste into cocaine hydrochloride, a fine, white, crystalline powder. Pure, packable, priceless. From jungle leaf to urban powder, the process was now a machine. Not mechanized, not clean, but repeatable, profitable. A kilo of paste, bought for a few $100s in the jungle, could become a kilo of cocaine worth thousands in Santiago and tens of thousands in the U.S. or Europe. Chile became the quiet engine of the trade. Until it didn't. In 1973, a military coup shattered the country. General Augusto Pinochet seized power, replacing the socialist government of Salvador Allende. The new regime didn't tolerate freelance crime. The smuggling networks were dismantled, labs raided. Figures like La Madrina vanished, arrested, killed, or forced into hiding. The Chilean connection was severed. But cocaine and its demand didn't disappear. In fact, the appetite in America and Europe was growing faster than ever. And where there is hunger, there will always be someone willing to feed it. So the trade moved. North, just up the coast, sat a country with old smuggling roots, fragile institutions, and a generation of ambitious young men desperate to prove themselves. Colombia. Here, in the shadows of the Andes, the next empire was about to rise. Not a government, not an army, but a machine. In Colombia, it didn't begin with war. It began with ambition. The young men who would build the cocaine machine weren't heirs to old money. They didn't belong to the ruling class. They weren't born into power. They earned it with bullets, chemistry, and vision. In the 1970s, as Chile's trafficking networks collapsed under military boots, Colombia absorbed the opportunity. Its mountains, rivers, and crumbling borders made it a trafficker's paradise. Its government, slow and fractured, barely noticed at first. And in the bustling city of Medellin, a low-level hustler named Pablo Escobar watched the pieces fall into place. He didn't invent the trade. He just saw it more clearly than anyone else. Escobar started small stolen cars, smuggled appliances, street scams. But when the cocaine wave arrived, he recognized it for what it was. Not a trend, not a niche, a revolution. He wasn't interested in moving a few kilos. He wanted to control everything from the leaf to the nose. To do that, he needed partners, infrastructure, loyalty, fear. He helped form what would become the Medellin cartel, a loose, deadly confederation of traffickers who agreed on one thing: the product was king, and Colombia would be its kingdom. Among the founding players were the Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio. Horse breeders with money and connections. They brought logistics. Others brought land, planes, chemists, cash. And one man brought something no one else had: the island. Carlos later, a half-German, half-Colombian idealist with a dangerous edge, purchased a Bahamian island, Norman's Cay. He built a runway, a radar system, warehouses with freezers. From there, cocaine could be flown straight into Florida. It was a tropical launch pad invisible to most, unstoppable to the rest. But this was just the beginning. The Medellin cartel did what no traffickers had done before. They industrialized cocaine. They funded coca farms in Bolivia and Peru to secure raw material. They built sprawling jungle labs, not huts, but compounds, with runways, dorms, generators, security. These weren't operations, they were cities. At Tranquilandia, one of their biggest lab complexes, they produced 10 to 20 tons of pure cocaine per week. Let that sink in. Tons per week. Then came transport, cargo planes, submarines, go-fast boats, hidden compartments in commercial flights, waterproof packages dropped into the sea for pickup by speedboats. Whatever it took. And then the money. Mountains of it. So much cash it became a problem. Small bills flooded back into Colombia by the truckload, hidden in shoes, TVs, suitcases, stuffed into walls, buried in fields. At one point, Escobar reportedly spent over $2,000 a month just on rubber bands to hold the money. His net worth soared into the billions. He became one of the richest men on earth, wealthier than some countries. And with that wealth came power. But Escobar wasn't satisfied with kingpin status. He wanted something more dangerous. He wanted to be legitimate. He ran for office, bought politicians, donated to charities, built homes. He styled himself as a modern Robin Hood, the man who gave back to the poor. But beneath the charity was a simple rule: plata o plomo, silver or lead. If you cooperated with customs, police, judges, you were rewarded. If you resisted, you were erased. It was a business model enforced with bombs. And Colombia began to bleed. Colombia wasn't just being poisoned. It was being reshaped. Pablo Escobar's cartel no longer operated within the cracks of the system. It was creating a parallel system, a narco-state with its own rules, its own armies, and its own foreign policy. When charm didn't work, violence answered. In 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice, dared to stand up. He exposed Escobar's connections, stripped him of his congressional seat, and refused the silver. He got the lead, shot down in the streets of Bogotá, in front of his driver, in front of the country. A line had been crossed, and Escobar didn't blink. Then came 1989. Luis Carlos Galán, the most popular presidential candidate in Colombia, had made one promise above all: extradition. Traffickers would no longer rot in Colombian prisons, they'd face U.S. courts. Real sentences, real cages. Galán was gunned down at a campaign rally. He never made it to Election Day. Escobar wanted to send a message, and it wasn't subtle. When César Gaviria, Galán's political ally, refused to back down, Escobar planted a bomb on Avianca Flight 203, believing Gaviria was on board. 107 civilians died. Gaviria wasn't among them. No apology, no denial. Soon after, a truck bomb tore through the Colombian Security Agency's headquarters in Bogotá. 70 people died. Hundreds were wounded. Glass rained from the sky. Smoke swallowed the capital. This wasn't crime, it was terrorism. The Medellin cartel had become more than a business. It was a shadow regime, enforcing its will through murder, fear, and cash. But while Escobar burned cities and buried judges, another force was rising, quieter, smarter, and in many ways more dangerous. In Cali, sun-drenched and polished, a different cartel watched Medellin's war unfold and chose a different path. The men who ran the Cali cartel were not warlords. They were board members. They called themselves Los Caballeros de Cali, the Gentlemen of Cali. Where Medellin used bullets, Cali used bribes. Where Escobar dropped bombs, the Cali bosses wrote checks. They didn't need to blow up buildings because no one would prosecute them in the first place. At the top were the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, Gilberto, the strategist, and Miguel, the tactician. They ran banks, owned pharmacies, controlled soccer teams. Their businesses were real, their books balanced, but woven beneath those spreadsheets was a river of white powder and billions of dollars in laundered profit. Their logistics genius was José Chepe Santa Cruz Londoño, who personally built their U.S. distribution network, starting in New York. And then there was Helmer Pacho Herrera, the cartel's enforcer and pipeline specialist, calm, precise, lethal. Together they professionalized cocaine. Cali didn't rely on jungle labs or secret airstrips alone. They used shipping containers, frozen food shipments, hollowed-out lumber, liquid chemical concealment. They embedded their product inside the machinery of global trade. One of their most audacious methods? Fake broccoli boxes of cocaine shaped and painted to look like frozen vegetables, packed on pallets among thousands of real ones. They bribed telecom employees to tap nearly every call entering or leaving Cali. They had police chiefs, politicians, and even journalists on payroll. And when a prosecutor got too close, they didn't need to threaten him. They just made a polite phone call and described his child's morning route to school. No shouting, no guns. The message was always understood. At their peak, the DEA estimated Cali controlled 80% of the world's cocaine market. They weren't just smugglers. They were a multinational conglomerate with a product that never stopped selling. And where was that product going? North, to a country ready, eager to inhale every last gram. The North wasn't just buying cocaine. It was building a culture around it. In the late 1970s and into the 1980s, America was in the midst of a transformation, political, economic, cultural. The optimism of post-war unity was gone. In its place, ambition without apology. It was the age of Reagan. Wall Street boomed. Luxury was virtue. Greed wasn't hidden, it was branded. The suit got sharper. The watch got heavier, and the lines of cocaine got longer. It wasn't a counterculture drug. It was a corporate one. Cocaine didn't mellow you out. It tuned you in, gave you the edge. It was for closers, for creatives, for late nights and early mornings. It whispered, "You're sharper now, faster, wittier." It became the secret sauce of success. In corner offices and studio backlots, it was discreetly passed in designer wallets, chopped on mirrored desks, dabbed on gums before pitches and deals. Nowhere embodied this new cocaine culture more than Studio 54, the most infamous nightclub in New York. Behind its velvet ropes, Fashion icons, financiers, and pop stars danced beneath glittering lights. The moon on the club's logo held a silver spoon to its nose, subtle as a wink. Cocaine wasn't whispered about here. It was expected. It was passed on silver trays. It was a status symbol not just to use, but to use well. Gold-plated razors, monogrammed spoons, custom-cut mirror kits. This wasn't drug use. It was a ritual, a performance. The elite embraced it. So did Hollywood. Actors took it between takes. Writers credited it for scripts. Musicians lined it across synthesizers. It wasn't just fueling creativity, it was marketing it. Films like Scarface dramatized it. Songs sang about white horses and snow. Magazines dropped winks in their interviews. And beneath all the sparkle, the numbers told the truth. Demand was exploding. The more Americans used, the more the Cali and Medellin cartels produced. And the more they produced, the more efficient they became. It was a perfect loop, a golden pipeline of money flowing south and a river of white powder flowing north. But in the margins, in neighborhoods far from Wall Street and the nightclubs, something else was brewing. Because the drug that started as luxury had a flaw. It was exclusive, expensive. It couldn't reach everyone. And someone, somewhere, was about to change that. With a stove, with baking soda, and with a recipe that would turn cocaine into something new. It was cheap, it was fast, and it hit harder than anything before. In the early 1980s, dealers in Los Angeles discovered a way to convert powder cocaine into something new, something that could be smoked. The process was simple: powder cocaine, baking soda, a little water, and heat. The result? A hardened, rock-like form of the drug that vaporized when smoked. Crack. It didn't require silver spoons or private clubs. No mirrors, no razors, no subtlety. Just a lighter. The high was immediate, intense. 10 seconds after the inhale, the rush slammed through the body, euphoric, overpowering, addictive. And it cost a fraction of powder cocaine. Suddenly, people who'd never touched drugs were hooked. Entire neighborhoods transformed. Corner stores turned into open-air drug markets. Teenagers became kingpins overnight. Schoolyards had lookouts. Homes had reinforced doors. Gunshots replaced music. Crack wasn't a party drug. It was a survival drug. And as it spread from L.A. to Detroit to Miami to New York to Baltimore, it didn't trickle, it flooded. In less than 5 years, crack use exploded across urban America. It didn't replace powder cocaine. It amplified the market. Dealers no longer had to wait for a wealthy client. They could move thousands of units to customers who paid $5 at a time, but came back 10 times a day. It was volume business, and the cartels noticed. Crack didn't need new supply chains. It used the same Colombian product, just processed differently. That meant more demand, more money, more opportunity. Everyone profited, except the cities. Violence surged. Homicides climbed. Hospitals saw waves of overdoses. Children were born addicted. Families unraveled. And soon, headlines began to shift. Crack babies, urban war zones, super predators. The media crafted a narrative fast, blunt, and brutal, and the government responded in kind. In 1986, the U.S. Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, with mandatory minimums for crack possession far harsher than for powder cocaine. It was a 100-to-1 sentencing ratio. 5 grams of crack meant the same sentence as 500 grams of powder. The law didn't just punish, it targeted. In poor neighborhoods, especially Black and Latino communities, the arrests piled up. The sentences were long, the resources were few, generations vanished behind bars. Meanwhile, in wealthy suburbs, users of powder cocaine, often white, often connected, got treatment, probation, a second chance. It was 2 drug wars. One fought with handcuffs, the other with counseling. And beneath it all, the supply never stopped, because the demand never stopped. America had declared war on drugs, but not on the reasons people used them. And the cartels? They just watched the news, counted the money, and kept the planes flying. The empire was thriving. but cracks were forming in the marble. The Medellin cartel, once untouchable, now found itself under siege. The Colombian government, pressured by years of terror, assassinations, and exploding cars, signed an extradition treaty with the United States. If captured, traffickers would no longer hide behind Colombian prisons. They'd be shipped north to face real time in American courts. To Pablo Escobar, this was worse than death, so he declared war. He called it the Extradite, a public campaign, complete with slogans, banners, and newspaper ads. We prefer a grave in Colombia to a cell in the U.S. And to prove he meant it, he unleashed a wave of destruction. Judges were assassinated, journalists were bombed, presidential candidates were gunned down in broad daylight. Whole cities felt like war zones. In 1991, Escobar made his move. He offered to surrender, but only if he could build his own prison. The government, bleeding and desperate, agreed. That prison was called La Catedral. It had a waterfall, a soccer field, a bar, a jacuzzi, and no guards. He was technically locked up, but still ran his empire from a luxury compound in the hills. It was a joke, an insult, but the world wasn't laughing for long, because even from inside La Catedral, Escobar kept killing. When news broke that he had murdered 2 cartel associates inside the compound, the Colombian government finally acted. They tried to move him. Escobar escaped, vanished. For over a year, the most powerful drug lord on earth became a ghost. The search was massive. Hundreds of agents, millions of dollars, satellites, intercepts, tip lines. But Escobar had built a city inside the city, thousands of loyalists, informants, and paid-off cops. Every time authorities got close, he vanished again. Until December 2nd, 1993. A signal was intercepted, a call traced, a rooftop surrounded. Escobar ran. He didn't get far. He died on a Medellin rooftop, barefoot, pistol in hand. A bullet through the ear. Colombia exhaled. The king of cocaine was gone. But the war wasn't over, because while Escobar had dominated headlines, the Cali cartel had dominated the market. And they weren't interested in bombs or body counts. They were businessmen, and they were just getting started. While the world was distracted by the chaos of Medellin, another empire had been quietly rising. The Cali cartel. They didn't throw grenades. They didn't bomb courthouses. They bought them. Where Escobar ruled with terror, Cali moved with strategy. Their motto? We don't kill judges, we buy them. They ran their operation like a Fortune 500 company, compartmentalized, data-driven, low profile. They had accountants, tech experts, lawyers on retainer. Each department operated independently. No one knew the whole system. That made it nearly impossible to dismantle. Their cocaine wasn't flown in with bravado. It was hidden in shipping containers, frozen produce, even statues. They used encrypted communications, fake front companies, offshore banking networks. At their peak, they controlled 80% of the global cocaine trade. They weren't flashy like Escobar. No zoos, no gold-plated guns, no bombastic interviews. Instead, they infiltrated systems. They had insiders in customs, police, airports, even government agencies. In Colombia, they were considered more dangerous than Escobar because they didn't need to terrorize, they simply corrupted. And in the United States, their product kept flowing. By the mid-1990s, the U.S. estimated that the Cali cartel was generating $7 billion per year. But their greatest strength, their invisibility, became their flaw. Because after Escobar's death, all eyes turned to Cali. And slowly, cracks began to appear. In 1995, a key defector handed over internal documents, names, routes, codebooks. The U.S. DEA and Colombian authorities launched a joint operation, Operation Cornerstone. Raids swept across Cali. Safe houses were seized, computers decrypted, bank accounts frozen. One by one, the godfathers were captured. Miguel and Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, the cartel's leaders, were arrested. The empire began to unravel. And by 1996, the once invisible cartel had collapsed. But the story wasn't over, because the market still existed. The pipelines were built, and nature hates a vacuum. New players would rise, more ruthless, more fragmented, and far harder to catch. With the fall of Cali, there was no crown, no single king. Instead, the empire splintered. Small factions, local bosses, rogue ex-military, corrupt cops turned traffickers. Each one carved out their own territory, their own pipeline. And so began the age of fragmentation. The drug trade became decentralized, harder to track, harder to stop. There wasn't one cartel to dismantle anymore. There were dozens, then hundreds. Mexico, once just a transit zone, evolved into a dominant force. The Juarez Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, and later, the most brutal of all Los Zetas. They weren't interested in low-profile corruption. They waged full-on war. Machine guns in the streets, mass graves in the desert, heads on highway overpasses, videos leaked online, graphic, horrifying, designed to send a message. The violence eclipsed even Escobar. And yet, the cocaine flowed. It changed hands more times, took longer to route, but it never stopped, because the demand had never stopped. In American cities, the crack epidemic left a scar, generations locked up, families broken, neighborhoods gutted, but new drugs filled the vacuum. Heroin, meth, synthetic opioids, fentanyl, each one more lethal, more addictive, cheaper to produce. And behind each wave, new traffickers rose. The names changed, the borders shifted, but the formula stayed the same. Supply plus demand plus desperation, profit. And the people still caught in the crossfire. From rural farmers in Colombia to inner-city kids in Chicago, the drug war wasn't just a law enforcement story. It was an economic story, a political story, a human story. And so, the war on drugs continues, not as a single battle, but as a perpetual cycle, a global engine of money, power, and pain, fueled by poverty, inequality, addiction, and silence. No matter how many arrests, no matter how many deaths, the trade adapts, because behind every fallen kingpin, there's someone waiting in the shadows, ready to rise. The fall of the great cartels did not bring peace. It brought something more diffuse and more unpredictable. When Pablo Escobar died and the Cali cartel unraveled under pressure from Colombian and American intelligence, it created a vacuum not of demand, but of leadership. The cocaine trade, so long dominated by monolithic entities, fragmented. Power splintered, territory became disputed. What followed was not a collapse, but a mutation. The beast had been wounded, not killed. It now had 1,000 heads. Where once the Medellin and Cali cartels had operated with industrial efficiency, albeit soaked in blood, the new actors were smaller, more agile and more volatile. Mid-level traffickers, former sicarios, corrupt military men, and opportunistic businessmen all vied for control. They lacked the grand vision of Escobar or the strategic diplomacy of the Cali leaders. What they possessed instead was raw ambition and a brutal pragmatism born of survival. This was the birth of what the DEA would eventually call the third generation of narco-traffic. In the highlands of Colombia, new routes were carved by machete through forest and rebellion. In Venezuela, corrupt generals offered protection in exchange for a cut. In Ecuador, quiet port cities began to transform into trafficking hubs as new players looked for backdoors into the Pacific. The epicenter of violence shifted northward. Mexico, long a corridor, now became a kingdom. The Mexican cartels, once subordinate transporters, emerged as empires in their own right. The Zetas, the Sinaloa Federation, the Gulf Cartel, and later the hyper-violent CJNG, Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, would not merely compete. They would unleash a form of warfare that blurred the line between cartel and insurgency. Whereas the Colombians had once feared government helicopters over the jungle, the Mexicans began to shoot them down. Each cartel developed its own signature of horror. The Zetas were militaristic, disciplined, and terror-driven, fond of public displays of mutilation to send messages. The Sinaloa group, under El Chapo's direction, combined brutality with business acumen, seeking political leverage as much as drug routes. The CJNG specialized in rapid expansion, making alliances with smaller gangs and then devouring them whole. Unlike the cartels of old, these were no longer just smuggling groups. They were arms dealers, extortionists, human traffickers, counterfeiters. Cocaine might still have been the crown jewel, but now it was only part of a broader portfolio of chaos. As Colombia demobilized and signed peace accords with its FARC guerrillas, the unintended consequence was to free up vast stretches of jungle previously controlled by insurgents. These regions, suddenly without oversight, became battlegrounds once more, but now for narcos. New coca fields were planted, jungle labs returned. Entire towns that had been pacified under FARC rule now found themselves under the thumb of unknown gunmen, some from rival gangs, others merely warlords in waiting. The narco state had not disappeared. It had relocated, reshaped, rebranded. And still, demand remained unshaken. Europe's appetite for cocaine surged. The Middle East opened new markets. West African coastal states became transshipment zones, their fragile governments bought or threatened into silence. In Guinea-Bissau, a country already hollowed by corruption, traffickers began using military barracks to store cocaine. In Gambia, airstrips that once saw cargo planes of fruit now hosted narco flights under cover of darkness. And through it all, the tentacles of the trade found new hosts. Businessmen in Dubai, pilots in Honduras, truckers in Texas, customs officials in Rotterdam. No border was secure, no country immune. The Hydra had changed forms, but its heart still beat in sync with the global economy's underbelly. In the past, you had to know someone. You had to walk the street, get the nod, meet in the shadows. Recruitment into the narco world was physical, direct, dangerous. But in the new era, everything changed. The street corner was replaced by the smartphone screen. The whisper in the alley became a DM on Instagram. The bloody initiation rite, once passed down through layers of fear and family, was now just a tap away. Welcome to the digital cartel. It began slowly, almost invisibly. Music had always been part of the narco mythos, the ballads of outlaws, the corridos of brave men who fought the system. But now, those corridos came with auto-tune. They came with filters. They came with cinematic drone footage of convoys moving through mountain passes, gold-plated AK-47s, tigers on leashes, women with plastic smiles. This was no longer folklore. This was branding. This was influence. The cartel lifestyle was rebranded as a dream. Young men in Sinaloa and Tamaulipas weren't just listening, they were watching. And soon, they were performing. TikTok became a theater of power. A 15-second video of a pickup truck packed with rifles bouncing over dirt roads. A masked figure posing beside bricks of cocaine stamped with luxury logos. A trap beat in the background. Emojis of flame, of skulls, of stacks of cash. This was the new recruitment poster. It didn't say, "Come die for the boss." It said, "Come live like a king." The algorithm rewarded extremity. The more dramatic, the more lavish, the more violent, the more likely to go viral. And the cartels noticed. Young sicarios began posting selfies in tactical vests. Videos showed children holding rifles taller than themselves. Teenagers bragged of missions and deliveries, filming themselves like vloggers on a ride-along. But this wasn't just content. It was warfare, a soft war, a cultural war. Because while the authorities monitored wiretaps and watched border crossings, the real battle was for minds. A cartel that could control the narrative didn't need to rule by fear alone. It could recruit with aspiration, influence with aesthetics, enslave with desire. Meanwhile, Apps like WhatsApp and Signal became operational tools. Communications were encrypted, coordinated across borders in seconds. GPS tags on Instagram stories revealed locations of rivals. Fake profiles were used to lure targets into traps. Telegram channels became hubs for narco propaganda, trafficking guides, and leaked videos designed to terrorize. And this influence wasn't confined to Latin America. In Europe, young gangs in Paris, Milan, and Rotterdam began mimicking the narco aesthetic. They wore the same brands, used the same slang. Their music videos, shot in low-income estates, featured the same visual codes: stacks of cash, religious icons, masked faces, fast cars, and messages of loyalty, betrayal, and brotherhood. Narco culture had become transnational. And just like that, the story of the drug trade shifted. No longer told in courtrooms or on news reports, but in content. A raid in Guadalajara might trend for an hour. A flashy narco TikTok might trend for a week. And it wasn't just the criminals watching. It was teenagers, kids, viewers too young to remember Escobar, too disconnected to understand the weight of the blood behind the gold chains. For them, this wasn't tragedy. It was entertainment. Governments tried to respond. TikTok purged hashtags. Instagram took down accounts. YouTube demonetized narco-themed content, but the Hydra adapted. New profiles appeared. Codes changed. A tiger emoji became a cartel symbol. A green square meant weed. A snowflake meant cocaine. Platforms scrambled, but they were always 2 steps behind. Because this wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about identity. Being a narco was now a digital persona, a performance, an aesthetic. For every real sicario showing off his arsenal, there were 10 imitators pretending. But for the cartels, that didn't matter. Every view was currency. Every share was recruitment. In a world where attention is power, the cartel that controlled the algorithm controlled the street. And as law enforcement kept looking for bodies, they missed the battle for perception. The modern cartel didn't need to control territory. It just needed to go viral. The phrase "war on drugs" once conjured images of jungle raids, DEA agents storming compounds, or Navy ships intercepting cocaine-laden submarines in the Pacific. But while those battles made headlines and action movie scripts, the real war, quieter, colder, bureaucratic, was unfolding in courtrooms and city jails, not against kingpins or smugglers, but against the users, the addicted, the poor. By the 1990s, the American criminal justice system had undergone a transformation from a tool of justice to a machine of punishment. Fueled by fear, media sensationalism, and bipartisan rhetoric, the war on drugs evolved into a policy of mass incarceration. New laws didn't just target dealers. They blanketed entire communities. They enforced mandatory minimums for possession. They created 3 strikes rules. They incentivized arrests, not rehabilitation. In neighborhoods already struggling with poverty, this was a death sentence. A teenager caught with a small amount of crack cocaine might receive decades behind bars. Meanwhile, a banker laundering millions for a cartel would walk free with a fine. The system didn't hide its bias. Crack cocaine, cheaper, used more often by black communities, carried far heavier penalties than powdered cocaine, more common in white suburbs. This wasn't justice. It was a design. Private prison companies emerged as a new industry. Their profits depended on keeping cells full. Lobbyists worked to ensure the continuation of harsh sentencing laws. A new economy was born, not of drugs, but of punishment. Contracts were signed that guaranteed minimum occupancy rates. Each inmate became a revenue stream. Every arrest fed the machine. And the machine needed to eat. Police departments received military surplus gear, tanks, rifles, tactical armor. Cities became battle zones. Raids increased. SWAT teams knocked down doors in the dead of night. Sometimes they found drugs. Sometimes they found children. Sometimes they found nothing. But always, the message was the same. There is no safe place, Not in your home, not in your neighborhood, not in your skin. Black and brown communities bore the brunt. Latino neighborhoods in Los Angeles, African-American blocks in Chicago, immigrant families in the Bronx. The war didn't hit equally, it hit predictably. Entire generations were funneled into the prison pipeline. A 14-year-old arrested for possession would come out at 24 with no job prospects, no education, and no choice but to return to the same street that led him there. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. And still, drugs flowed. Despite billions spent, borders hardened, and prisons filled, the street corner remained stocked. Addiction rates remained constant. The supply never truly broke, because the problem was never the substance. It was the pain behind it. In towns hollowed by unemployment, in cities where hope had a price tag, in rural America, where prescription opioids were handed out like candy and then taken away without warning. The drug user wasn't a villain, he was a symptom. But the war couldn't admit that. It needed enemies, and if it couldn't find them at the top of the chain, it would punish the bottom. And yet, even within this darkness, there were voices, activists, journalists, families. They spoke of reform, of harm reduction, of treating addiction as illness, not crime. Slowly, ideas like safe injection sites, decriminalization, and community-based rehab began to surface. But for every step forward, there were two back: a new law, a new crackdown, a new wave of moral panic. And through it all, the prisons swelled. In the 1980s, the U.S. prison population hovered under 500,000. By the 2000s, it had exploded to over 2 million, more than any other country in the world. Entire rural towns became dependent on the prison economy. Schools lost funding while jails got upgrades. America wasn't just fighting a war, it was building a system. And the war didn't stop at the border. Policies shaped in Washington echoed into Latin America. Countries were pressured to militarize their police. Aid was tied to drug enforcement statistics. Farmers in Colombia were sprayed with chemicals. Villages in Honduras were raided. And all the while, cartels adapted, moved, shifted, grew. The war on drugs, instead of weakening the enemy, created a resilient, flexible, global organism. One that knew how to survive, because while the governments looked for drugs, the real game had changed. It was about influence, infrastructure, corruption, and demand. Always demand. As long as there were people hurting, people numbing, people chasing escape, there would be drugs. And as long as the system punished pain instead of healing it, the war would remain unwinnable. Not because the enemy was too strong, but because the battlefield was the wrong one. There are places in the world where the government still has a name, still holds elections, still sends police, but where, in truth, the power belongs to someone else, where the local mayor obeys quietly, where the police work both sides, and where the cartel is not a threat to the state, but the state itself. This isn't fiction. It's the slow transformation of democracy into narco-democracy. It begins subtly: a generous donation to a mayor's campaign, protection for a local business, a road paved here, a clinic funded there. In towns forgotten by national budgets, the cartels step in like saviors. They fill the vacuum of governance, offer jobs when the economy fails, provide order when the police do not, and with each small favor, they collect loyalty or fear, often both. In Michoacán, armed groups once calling themselves self-defense militias morphed into cartel factions. In Guerrero, politicians were handpicked by traffickers. Entire villages became battlegrounds not just for drugs, but for control of schools, permits, trade, and justice. In Sinaloa, funerals for drug lords drew thousands, flags lowered. Businesses closed, as if mourning the death of a president, because in those regions, that's exactly what it felt like. Cartels didn't just buy off the government, they became it. It was a strategy as old as empire conquer, not by force alone, but by necessity. When a community comes to rely on the cartel for medicine, food, infrastructure, or even discipline, resistance becomes unthinkable. In some towns, there are two sets of rules: the official ones posted by the state, and the real ones whispered at night, enforced by men with radios and rifles. And when elections came, they were already decided. Candidates who refused to cooperate disappeared. Campaign buses were burned. Voters were told sometimes with flyers, sometimes with bullets, who to support. In the 2021 Mexican elections, dozens of political candidates were assassinated. Not in the shadows, in the open, because the message wasn't just for them, it was for everyone. Power doesn't wear a suit, it wears a mask. In Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador narco-politics expanded. High-ranking officials were exposed as cartel allies. Campaigns were funded with laundered money. Laws were passed to protect interests. Anti-corruption prosecutors were fired or fled into exile. Journalists investigating the connections vanished or were killed, and the public, trapped between violence and silence, learned to navigate a system where truth was dangerous and lies were law. Even in places where the cartels didn't fully run the government, they influenced its every move. A military operation couldn't proceed without political approval. A judge's decision might be reversed after a single threat. Police commanders had to choose: play along or be replaced, sometimes permanently. The narco state didn't need to declare itself. It simply operated in parallel. A shadow government with real weapons, real money, real power. It controlled land, trade, migration routes, and local economies. In many ways, it was more efficient than the bureaucracies it replaced. It didn't wait for permits. It didn't argue over budgets. It acted, and people noticed. In communities abandoned by globalization, in regions hollowed by poverty, the narco system offered something the official state could not: immediacy. Help came fast. Decisions came fast. Justice, however brutal, came fast. It was a terrifying efficiency, but for some, it was better than nothing. And in this gray zone between criminal and political, a new type of leader emerged: narco-politicians. Figures who walked the line between legitimate office and underground empire, mayors with cartel ties, senators with family connections to traffickers, presidents accused of accepting campaign money in exchange for blind eyes. The mask of respectability began to slip, and beneath it, the same story repeated: power, protected by fear, sustained by silence. But the greatest danger of the narco state wasn't just corruption, it was the normalization of it, the slow shift in public expectations, the belief that justice was a luxury, that politics was theater, that safety came not from the law, but from the favor of the local boss. And once that belief takes root, it's hard to uproot. Because when a society stops trusting the state, it begins to make deals with the devil. And the devil always collects. The age of the regional drug cartel is ending. The narco empires of the late 20th century, Medellin, Cali, Guadalajara, were bound by place. They ruled neighborhoods, corridors, coastlines. Their power was territorial. But today, the trade has transcended geography. Cartels have become borderless. Their networks stretch from the coca fields of South America to the ports of Rotterdam, the suburbs of Toronto, the rave scenes of Sydney, the back streets of Lagos. What began as a Latin American phenomenon has become a global commodity empire. No longer reliant on massive drug shipments, modern traffickers operate like distributed systems: small shipments, smaller operators, decentralized logistics. Anonymity is a shield. A new generation of narco-entrepreneurs emerged less like warlords, more like CEOs. They used encrypted phones, shell companies, dark web marketplaces, and crypto wallets. They laundered money through art, real estate, online gaming, and offshore banking. This wasn't gangsterism, it was corporate. In Africa, cartels set up new routes through West African nations' ports with weak oversight, airports with low security, customs officers easily bought. In Asia, methamphetamine production in the Golden Triangle surged. with supply chains stretching into Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, facilitated by Chinese precursor chemicals and regional criminal alliances. Europe became a major consumption zone, with cities like Antwerp and Rotterdam becoming key entry points. Violence spilled onto the streets of Brussels, Marseille, Naples. Local gangs, often immigrant-run, became foot soldiers for global syndicates. The Colombian, Mexican, Albanian, and Nigerian networks didn't compete, they collaborated. Even in the United States, once the center of the war on drugs, cartels adapted. Fentanyl replaced heroin, cheaper, easier to smuggle, and more addictive. Labs in Mexico churned out synthetic opioids with precursor chemicals from China. Deaths surged, but instead of street dealers, shipments moved through mail carriers, hidden in toys, shipped in bulk. The supply chain had evolved, and with it, the danger. But perhaps the most profound shift wasn't logistical, it was ideological. The cartel of the future doesn't need loyalty, it doesn't need flags, it needs efficiency. It outsources everything, production to chemists, logistics to hackers, marketing to influencers. The new narco-economy functions like a startup, low overhead, high return, no borders. And this evolution presents a nightmare for law enforcement, because you can't raid an idea. You can't arrest a network with no leader. You can't sanction a ghost. International cooperation has struggled to keep up. Laws vary by country. Extradition treaties are fragile. Tech platforms resist surveillance. And while governments chase shadows, the trade persists. Because at its core, the global drug economy doesn't need violence to thrive. It needs demand. And that demand remains insatiable, profitable, constant. The world now faces a new paradigm. One where crime blends into capitalism, where illicit flows run parallel to legal markets, where the same app used to order groceries can arrange a drug drop, where your favorite influencer might unknowingly promote a brand backed by laundered money. In this world, the cartel isn't a monster in the jungle. It's a click, a code, a commodity. It's everywhere and nowhere.